Okay, we'll get started. Welcome to the introduction portion of the CVPR 2021 tutorial on fine-grained visual analysis with deep learning. My name is Serge Belongie, currently at Cornell University, and I'll be starting at University of Copenhagen in July. So here's a quick glance at the outline of the topics I want to cover. Since this is about fine-grained visual analysis, we need to have an idea of what fine-grained and coarse-grained means. So we're going to introduce granularity. We'll talk about subordinate categories and some of the historical work that's relevant involving parts and attributes. We'll also go over some of the challenges involved with long-tailed distributions, look at some of the popular data sets that are out there. And we will look at some problems that go beyond fine-grained visual categorization, specifically into more recent open research topics, which brings us to the last area, looking at the open problems in the general domain of fine-grained visual analysis. Now, to take a slide from Shushen, you may see this again later. This tutorial is focused on fine-grained image recognition. So the community is generally more aware of generic image recognition, also known as coarse-grained. So on the left, when we talk about coarse-grained or generic recognition, what we're looking at is things like birds versus dogs or oranges versus bicycles. And we're not so concerned with the specific varietal of the citrus fruit or the breed of the dog. It's really just about those high-level categories versus one another. In the case of fine-grained image recognition, we are concerned about things like dog breed or these minor differences between tightly related categories. Ryan Farrell has a slide that shows this along a spectrum. And there are no hard boundaries here, but this spectrum gives you an idea of the domain of interest for this tutorial. So on the far left of this spectrum, we have the basic or generic categories. So that would be, for example, frog versus piano. On the far right, we have the study of discrimination between specific individuals. For example, biometrics for people. Or if you're looking at camera traps on giraffes and you want to know specifically which giraffe was spotted in the camera trap, that would be a case of biometrics. So we're interested in subordinate categories, which are somewhere in the middle. So this includes both things like penguin versus owl, so the different species, but same family. Or you could look at chickadees that have very subtle differences in the coloration of the feathers. So those both fall under subordinate categories, and that's the part of that categorization spectrum that's of interest to us. These domains are quite fascinating. For example, this is a rather cryptic looking figure also from Ryan. Can anyone guess what this is showing? So this is actually a diagram of eyes of spiders. So these are actually different in cardinality, they're different in geometry. For the most part, they have bilateral symmetry, but this is an example of a very fine-grained category. Outside of biodiversity, you can find interesting fine-grained categories in e-commerce. So here we have men's shoes and women's shoes, and there's a continuum of heel heights and different types of laces and colors and materials. So there's arguably just as much richness in the features and the hierarchy and the ontology in the man-made world as there is in the biodiversity domains. Food is another domain. You'll see later some of the data sets of interest involve food, cooked meals, ingredients, and so on. So one thing, as I mentioned in the beginning, it's important for us to get a sense of what we mean by granularity, fine-grained versus coarse-grained. And in approaching this, we also need to think about the human versus the machine perspective. So at a high level, the granularity of a data set, for example, a data set of bird species or a data set of appetizers, these depend on the ground truth labeling and the function that's used to compute distances or some notion of dissimilarity between entities. Now, it's important to think about the role of human expertise here, because from the machine perspective, all of the entities under consideration are just vectors in a high-dimensional space. The fact that they're birds or men's shoes really means nothing to the machine at all. It's high-dimensional data. It's either tightly related, closely packed, hard to distinguish, or perhaps it's easy to distinguish. The labels, I'm exaggerating here, but the labels mean nothing to the machine. From the human perspective, there is a lot of meaning to the labels that are imparted to these fine-grained categories. So there's this meme on the right, it's just a joke. From a physicist's perspective, it's just a bird. Perhaps they'd even approximate the bird as a sphere. But in the case of biology, all of the different parts and attributes of the bird are quite interesting. So it really depends on your perspective. Where is your area of specialized expertise? So within ornithology, for example, we would know what all those parts are called. So my point here is that we need to think about both the human and the machine perspective, and that it's actually possible that there are data sets that are so-called fine-grained in name only. In other words, we have the intuition that a data set, such as one for appetizers, that we sense that it's fine-grained, but in terms of the objective features that are presented to the machine, it may be no different than a coarse-grained problem, okay? So Yin Tsui did some work with collaborators at Google and Cornell and Facebook to attempt to quantify granularity. So here we took one of the popular data sets, Cub 200, database of birds, and that full data set of 200 birds is generally regarded as the quintessential fine-grained data set. Birds kind of connotes the idea of fine granularity. Whereas a data set like CFAR 10 generally is regarded as a coarse-grained data set. So I won't go into details here, but Yin developed a quantitative notion of granularity where something coarse-grained would have a perfectly coarse-grained would have a granularity of 1.000, and something very fine-grained would have a granularity close to 0.000. So what we did in this study was take different subsets of birds from the Cub 200 data set just to make a point. This is just a qualitative illustration. It's a quantitative illustration, but it's hand-picked examples. So what Yin did was he created two subsets, a bitter subset, bitter meaning hard, difficult, needing lots of domain expertise, and a sweet subset, which is shown in the second row. And those are birds that have very prominent differences in texture and color and shape and so forth. So the point here is, according to this quantitative measure of granularity, it turns out that the sweet subset of birds with the prominent, very different colors, they're actually coarser grained than the CFAR 10 data set. And indeed, if you pick a bitter subset, like shown in the top row, you do get something that's quantitatively finer grained because you're looking at birds that just differ in some very minor features. Now, this is far from settled. It is, in fact, this paper has not been accepted. It's been rejected multiple times. I view that as a positive thing in the big picture because it means this is still an open problem. And I'll talk more about that later. Just going to the historical perspective, before the deep learning revolution and the proliferation of studies into fine-grained visual analysis, one of the really popular approaches advanced by Christoph Lampert and Ali Farhadi and collaborators was attribute-based classification or part and attribute-based classification. So the idea here, again, this was before deep learning, but it's the concept could apply in any machine learning framework. The idea is to have two different layers of classification. So there's an abstraction from the specific entity to attributes that supervene on all of these different categories. I'm just going to pause here. So the idea is in these different layers, you would first have an attribute classifier for things like stripes, or even non-visual or non-obviously visual things like eats fish or furry. So you would have these different classifiers that operate up front, and then you would define in a second layer of classification, you would feed the output of those attribute classifiers to another classifier that puts together that information and determines what the final answer is. So here, that I also mentioned that attributes can be put together like parts. You can think of attributes like adjectives, and the parts could be like nouns. The parts have position. So it's conceivable, for example, in a biodiversity data set, that you could have a set of parts and attributes that are shared even across different species. So you would run these attribute and part detectors up front and get perhaps a logarithmic scaling benefit in the big picture for how this works. Now, about a little more than 10 years ago, the Visipedia group, so this was between UCSD and Caltech at the time, we did a study that was built on this notion of parts and attributes and the associated complementarity of human and machine capabilities. So we wanted to tap into, if you look at these different examples, knowing the coarse-grained category for the image on the left, whether it's a chair or airplane, that's very easy for a human. Whereas looking at problem B, determining what specific species of bird it is rather hard. But if you break it down into parts and attributes, which is to say something like a field guide, then it actually becomes somewhat easier for humans. So we built a system based on this, and it was based on a sequential generation of questions that are maximizing expected information gain. And the idea is you put the image into the system and you proceed to reduce the uncertainty of the classification by getting all these questions or part clicks answered. So we were able to show that the humans and the machines working together can get an answer fairly efficiently. So this is also related to at the time, the proliferation of data sets that had key points, because the community generally felt, particularly in the case of fine-grained categories, that it would be necessary to capture some kind of representation of pose, something that would allow you to capture the different kinds of articulation of these different objects. At least that was what we thought at the time. But it turned out this didn't anticipate what was coming with the deep learning revolution. And so I have this funny term here called antediluvian. It's a play on the term antediluvian, which means before the flood. So this is basically papers that were written before 2012. And as we all know, people don't generally focus on key points and interest points and parts and attributes anymore. Our community generally just trains big black boxes, whether it's fine-grained or coarse-grained, and hopefully through some kind of attention mechanism, or perhaps even a mechanism we don't understand, some kind of meta notion of parts and attributes is instantiated somewhere inside that black box. Before we were truly willing to let go of the antediluvian thinking, we tried to do a kind of hybrid method that found different parts of the bird based on key point detectors and warped them to some kind of normalized representation, and then ran those through independent convnets and then a final classifier. And for a few months, that was actually the top performing algorithm on Cub 200. But fairly quickly that was washed away by big black box approaches. So the idea there, I just wanted to show you that there was some historical work involving parts and attributes. It's entirely possible that that will come back in the domain of fine-grained image analysis. But for the time being, it's more of a theoretical notion, and the massive sort of big data driven deep learning approaches and transformer methods aren't explicitly paying so much attention to that. Another thing that we have to bear in mind is the reality of long-tailed fine-grained data sets. So if we take another one of the popular data sets, iNaturalist, for example, they have tens of thousands of categories and millions of images contributed by citizen scientists. And this is very far from a uniform distribution of samples for all the different instances of species of plants, animals, and fungi. Some of the species that are in there, like on the far left of this plot showing the long tail, the monarch butterfly is very overrepresented. So iNaturalist basically never needs to see another example of a monarch butterfly. Whereas on the far right, there's a kind of insect that I believe is only found in New Zealand, and there really aren't that many examples of it. So that may even be the extreme of one-shot learning. And of course, there are species that have gone extinct, in which case you would have zero shot. And the only way you could recognize those is through some shared notion of parts and attributes. So this is just something to anticipate as you go through the rest of the tutorials today, that the long tail is something we must confront. It's not like a lab produced data set where you magically get equal amounts of training data for every example. This is a phenomenon that's not just seen in biodiversity, it's also in fashion and interior design and coin collecting. All sorts of domains have this phenomenon. So we need to train models that are capable of handling the long tail. Another thing that has to do with scaling to large numbers of domains is the concept of domain similarity. So at first, if you're looking at very diverse fine-grained data sets like flowers or airplanes, they have very little to do with one another. But if you have collected a very large data set of birds, and then you go on to Lepidoptera, which is moths and butterflies, it could be that the pre-trained network for one is very useful for the other, although it may still need quite a bit of fine-tuning. So this raises the possibility of some kind of overarching distance between entire data sets or between entire trained models that would give you a sense of bulk domain similarity. So there's some research that's done there. Just something to keep in mind as you start scaling to very large numbers of fine-grained categories. Now let's just take a look at some of the popular fine-grained benchmark data sets. So I've already mentioned Cub 200, that's the Caltech UCSD Birds 200 data set, which goes back to 2011. And this was put forward by the Visipedia group. Over time, starting with an early version of Cub 200 in 2010, going up to 2019 in this plot, you can see that the accuracy has just been growing steadily. And the blue dots here represent the deep learning based approaches. And now they're not shown here, but the transformer based approaches are doing even better. So this was originally something where the accuracy was around 18% using antediluvian features. That was abysmal performance, but it was something just to get the data set out the door. And now this data set is essentially considered easy. Another representative example of a taxonomic group or taxon used for fine-grained visual categorization is the herbarium data set, which is now in its second or third edition at the FGVC workshops. So these are pressed specimens. So they're dried and pressed onto herbarium sheets, and they have some textual metadata. So this is an instance where museums have very large collections of these physical specimens. And there's a push to digitalize all of these and be able to do global studies for biodiversity. So this is a very interesting data set. Stanford dogs is another popular one going back to 2011. So this one is not species discrimination. It's all the same species, but it's just different breeds. Another example that's even older. So this is part of the prehistory of fine-grained visual analysis is the Oxford flowers data set. So here we have around 100 classes. Stanford cars is another example. Just as the FGVC workshop was taking off, Stanford cars was one of the influential early data sets. So that involves the make and model and year, rather not specific year, but year range. So make, model, and year range for around 200 categories of car with different poses. I've mentioned at a couple points the FGVC workshop. So the FGVC workshop started around 10 years ago, and a few years into it, it's always attached to CVPR. A few years into it, we decided to launch a set of challenges that involve biodiversity and food and fashion, apparel, and so on. And so there's quite a few of these curated competitions, and they're run on Kaggle. So there are hundreds of people, hundreds of teams that collaborate, that compete to win on these different challenges. Sometimes there's cash prizes for this. Sometimes it's just for the glory of winning on the Kaggle leaderboard. You can see in the lower left, one of the examples that's particularly challenging is camera trap images, which are generally infrared. So that raises another challenge. So then there's the question of going beyond simple classification. So I've overwhelmingly focused on this question of what is in this image. So I present an image to the computer. It's a certain kind of wasp, and I want the computer to tell me the fine-grained category, the species, and so on. So some recent work is just reminding us that when you are interacting with the experts in those domains, although answering that question of what is in this image is kind of impressive from a computer science perspective, for the scientist that's studying those domains, it's actually not that impressive because they probably knew that answer already. At most, that kind of computer vision approach would speed up the work that they're doing if they have a large data set that they need to work through. What they're more interested in are downstream tasks. So in terms of modern computer vision and machine learning, we would think of this in terms of learned representations and how useful are those learned representations for different tasks, different downstream tasks. So an example of that from Grant Van Horn and collaborators is something called NEWT, the natural world tasks. So here, this is based on a set of so-called studies. There's a field in iNaturalist called a study. And there are 8 studies here that involve, well, appearance, that's just the general, the usual fine-grained categorization, that's the species. Then there's attributes like whether the coat or fur of an animal is associated with winter or spring. There's appearance, like in plant pathology, you can have a healthy leaf or certain kinds of spots or fungal disease. Appearance, another kind of appearance would be the age or life stage. That could be as diverse as going from the egg to juvenile to even deceased is one of the categories of life stage. Gestalt is one of those qualitative things. It has to do with the overall impression of the quality of the image. Context, what is the bird doing in that picture? Is it getting nectar? Is it singing? So that could be a set of categories that are associated with that particular species. And then there's counting or subitizing, and finally behavior such as mating. So these are all examples of studies that biodiversity researchers want to do. And so this new work, which is going to be presented next week, is looking at how effective these learned representations are for the classic fine-grained visual categorization problem for attacking these different types of downstream tasks. And this, again, is something that's very popular these days with contrastive learning. We want to know about the novel kinds of things that a representation is capable of doing. So this brings us to the last part, which is just a discussion or a preview of some of the open problems that exist in fine-grained image analysis. As I indicated in the beginning, one of the questions is just, what does fine-grained mean? There have been over a decade's worth of fine-grained visual categorization workshops, and it turns out that none of us have actually written down a formal characterization of granularity. So Yin, as I mentioned, has started to work on that. It's very complicated because it depends on the labels of the data as well as the distance function. So it's very hard to come up with some kind of universal dimensionless quantity that would capture that notion of granularity. So we need to define that problem if we claim to be doing science. Then there's the ever-present problem of data efficiency or labeling efficiency. So when you're working with fine-grained categories, almost by definition, it means that you're dealing with communities of specialized expertise. Coarse-grained image data sets generally can be scraped from the web. You can get web-lead supervised data for things like bicycles as a general category or citrus fruit as a general category. But if you're actually doing something fine-grained that's meant for users that are stakeholders in a particular domain of expertise, again, they're not impressed by that kind of generic categorization. So that means that you need well-curated data sets. You need to tap into those communities of expertise, either out of the goodness of their hearts, they'll provide help, or they need to be compensated. And that raises this question, how much data do we need? How much are we able to share features between different domains, between different categories? And that leads to the next question, which is how much we can do self-supervised or semi-self-supervised approaches in the fine-grained setting. It's very popular these days to make use of increasingly complex augmentation functions to do contrastive learning. The augmentations that are typically used off the shelf are things like mirror flipping or color space jittering or cropping, jigsaw, and so forth. And there's some work that's emerging that's showing that that kind of garden variety augmentation is not necessarily appropriate in fine-grained settings. So it could be that when it comes to contrastive learning and the kind of augmentations we need to train such models, we may need, this is just speculation, but we may need to go back to the part and attribute-based thinking and be a little bit more strategic in how we generate those synthetic transformed images. And then, of course, there's this ever-present question of going beyond static images. Particularly if you look at biodiversity or if you look at human data sets like dancing or fighting or different sports, it really makes sense to push into the multimodal direction. So making use of video clips, combining that with spectrogram data or audio more generally. So fine-grained image analysis really needs to progress into the direction of fine-grained multimodal analysis. I think that a lot of the raw material is there for us to make big strides as a field. But we all know that working with video is just harder in every way. And so we're still working to get the most out of these static images as possible. And yeah, so that's just a sense of some of the open problems. This is really just to set the stage for the rest of the day with these tutorials. And I hope you enjoyed this talk and the rest of the tutorial material you'll see later today. Thank you for your attention.